sentence that I bet you've never heard anybody say, and that as long as you live, you will never hear another person say. And it's the truth. I once met a man who was crucified. Not figuratively, not in a dream, not in any sense other than he was nailed to cross poles and left in the sun to die. He didn't die, and I got to talk to him and interview him in person in Nairobi, Kenya. And his name was Agostino Noor, and he was a catechist in the Nuba Mountains. Because of the persecution in the Sudan of the Christians in the Nuba Mountains, it was very difficult, if not impossible, for priests to be in this area. So they relied on catechists, which were, lay people who traveled around teaching the faith to isolated communities. And this man did it for a long time, and he was captured by the forces of the Sudanese government, and they crucified him. And they did a number of other things, torture-wise, before he was crucified. But when they crucified him, they said to him, "Now die like Jesus Christ." Well, he didn't die. Some other people came along and took him down off the tree, or off the poles, and he survived. But as John said, I did a lot of work in Sudan from the middle 90s to the middle 2000s. And what I'm telling you is unavoidably, to some extent, autobiographical. And since it is, and since I was there and saw these people and talked to them, sometimes the memories of that come back in a way that collapse emotional distance. And I can't talk about some of these things without feeling it. So I'm going to try to keep emotional distance from it, but I'm simply saying to you, since I was there and I saw them and I talked to them, sometimes that comes back. I'll tell you more about how I got involved in Sudan and what I did as I talk about the situation. I want to read from a law review article that another professor and I did some years ago that will give you a sense of the situation in Sudan at that time. And this article was from the 90s. For more than 10 years, the government of Sudan waged war against its own citizens, resulting in the greatest humanitarian and human rights catastrophe in the world. Not just called that by me, but by others. The war claimed more than 2 million lives and displaced an additional 4 million people. You may not have realized that scale. That was documented by the U.S. Committee on Refugees. And while all sides in the Sudan civil war committed human rights abuses, the forces of the Sudanese government, which a scholar called the worst practitioner of religious persecution and the worst violator of human rights in the world, that government bears the largest share of responsibility. The government in Sudan tried to break the spirit of its opponents. It attacked civilians, used famine as a weapon, and countenanced the revival of slavery. Sudan also sponsored international terrorism and was so designated by the U.S. State Department, and was considered the worst sponsor of state terrorism, the worst state sponsor of terrorism in the world. The aim, again found by the Department of State of the United States, the aim of all this was to force the non-Arab, non-Muslim people of the South and other marginalized regions, such as the Nuba Mountains, to abandon their culture and religion. The Department of State called it forced Islamization and forced Arabization. So let me give you a little bit of history about Sudan. Like so many places in the world, it has a long, rich history. It's heavily influenced by Egypt. Of course, it also heavily influenced Egypt. Some of the pharaohs were Nubians. But when Egypt became Christian then in the first centuries, then Egypt played the leading role in spreading Christianity down the Nile. However, when Islam engulfed or conquered Egypt in the 7th century, the Nubia, or northern Sudan, was cut off from the rest of the Christian world, and it kind of withered away, although some Christian kingdoms persisted until to the late 1500s. Then Western Christians, Catholics, and Protestants began to re-evangelize Sudan in the 19th century. One of those was a Catholic priest named Daniel Comboni, who founded a religious order dedicated to helping Africans evangelize Africa. And among the Catholics in Africa, he's considered a great saint. And then Western Christians came to fight against the slave trade. There had been a slave trade for centuries and centuries. And also the British then took over this area. And some English came to fight against the slave trade and to fight against the forces resisting them, such as General Gordon in Khartoum, who was killed in a famous battle in 1885. Now, Sudan is the largest country in Africa. And of those, and if you think about, I'll just give you a sense of how big it is. You know, you can see in your own mind's eye how big the USA is. You know, it's continent wide, you know, coast to coast. Huge country. And Sudan itself is 1/4 the size of the United States. And it gained its independence from Britain in 1950. At that time, in 1950, about 2/3 of the population occupying the northern 2/3 of the country was culturally Arab and Muslim. The remaining 1/3 of the population, which was principally in the south, were tribes. They were not culturally mixed, so they were black African, and they followed animism, traditional African religions, although a certain number at that time were Christians, probably less than 20%. Under British colonial rule, the definition of South Sudan was the area below the 12th parallel, and that meant that it included, so South Sudan included this area, the Nuba Mountains, that I'm going to talk a lot about. But when the Islamic fundamentalist government seized power, it changed that definition, and the South became the area beneath the 8th parallel, which excluded the Nuba Mountains and left them as part of the North. So, I mean, if you think about it, it's not surprising that racial, religious, culturally different areas, the northern 2/3 and the southern 1/3, were not an ideal mix for a country, and they had an uneasy coexistence from the very beginning. Religious discrimination, though not persecution, was begun by the North against the South after Sudanese independence in 1956. Immediately after independence, the teaching of the Quran was required in the southern schools, and any of the missionary schools that existed were nationalized. The Ministry for Religious Affairs was staffed entirely by Muslims. And in 1964, the Sudanese government expelled all Muslim missionaries. Although the situation improved a little bit after John Paul II visited Sudan in 1993, it didn't improve too much. And the reason for that was, this is kind of the key sequence of dates, is a civil war began in '83 when President Numeri tried to impose Islamic law on the entire country, including, the non-Muslim part of the country. And he had been under pressure. He had been seen as a model ruler in the world. He was held up in many of the, I don't know if you remember, but there was the non-aligned nations movement and all that, to be not West or East, and he was kind of a leader, but he came under a lot of pressure from Islamic radicals, which their name, or the name of the organization, is the National Islamic Front. And then, so the civil war began in '83 because they tried to impose Sharia, and then in '89 the National Islamic Front overthrew Numeri in a military coup and took power. And it made religious persecution a centerpiece of its campaign against non-Muslims. Now, we know this from, what the government itself said, including Hassan al-Turabi, who was the intellectual and spiritual leader of the Sudanese regime. He was at that time. And he said very simply, to be Sudanese is to be Muslim. Islam is the only religion for Sudan and for Africa. The leaders of the NIF saw Christianity as a rival for the allegiance of Sudanese and of Africans. And in 1992, a huge area in Sudan called Kordofan, that governor of that area declared a jihad in the Nuba Mountains. And that call was renewed in the year 2000, the call for a jihad against non-Muslims. Now, the Sudanese government, the National Islamic Front, that's who I'm talking about, the National Islamic Front. They still control the government in Sudan. They make a great break from traditional Sudanese relations between, at least traditional way of being a Muslim in Sudan. Two Sudanese scholars, immigrants or refugees, one of whom is Muslim and one of whom isn't, wrote the following. About 70% of the population profess Islam nominally, but Sudanese Muslims subscribe to a wide diversity of beliefs and practices. More significantly, the experience of Islam in Sudan was largely social rather than political. To the extent that Islam had a political role before the NIF seized power in 1989, it was characterized by toleration and peaceful coexistence. And in fact, the National Islamic Front persecuted Muslims who were not its kind of Muslims, which meant they weren't fanatical against everybody else, such as the Bija tribe of northern Sudan. The NIF confiscated their property and gave some of it to their wealthy supporters, including Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden operated farms in Sudan, and he was supported by the government. Now, okay, so why did I get involved? Well, I got involved because I was working as a human rights lawyer, and I met a bishop from Sudan who came into my office and who wanted help. And he said nobody was paying attention to this, and nobody was. So I decided to help him, and I set up an organization, an NGO, to work in Sudan. And so why was it necessary for me to set up an NGO? Because the United Nations would not go to the areas where the Nuba Mountains. That area was off limits. It was a no-fly zone. The UN had established something called Operation Lifeline Sudan to bring in relief, but it couldn't go into these areas of the Nuba Mountains. And also the government of Sudan manipulated even when the OLF, the Operation Lifeline Sudan, got permission. So it used food aid against its own people, or the manipulation of food aid against its own people. So I set up an NGO in order to go into the areas where you could not go. So we would rent planes on the border of Kenya and fly in illegally into the most remote areas, under fire, luckily not under very effective fire, and deliver food and seeds and stuff like that. We were, we were bombed on the runway once. Although, the word runway is so misleading, because what it is basically a field where they cut down and pulled up as many trees and stumps as they can, so it's a very difficult place to land. But the government forces once, unfortunately, caught us there and bombed us and killed some of our people. When we were in country, we had bodyguards because the government wanted to kill us. The government's aim was to forcibly, as I said a minute ago, forcibly Arabize and Islamicize the people of the Nuba Mountains, or the whole country if they could. But certainly, since the Nuba Mountains was in Sudan itself, not in the south, they wanted to Islamicize and Arabize it forcibly, and they would use food as a weapon. And they had there was a terror tactic that I remember to this day. When you would go in, the only thing that saved everybody was that they didn't have highly effective weapons to kill you. But what they had were what are called barrel bombs. So they would fly over in these Antonov Russian planes and push out these barrel bombs, which when they hit the ground would explode shrapnel at about this height, about thigh high. And the whole point was to maim so lots of people were killed in their fields, but it got to be the point whenever you heard an airplane, because there was, except us going in, anytime you heard an airplane, it was a Sudanese government plane coming to bomb you. You dug little trenches. So everybody, in your little, you were in huts that were, wooden type, not, beehive type huts. They're not easy to see from up above. And, but you'd have you dig these ditches, and every time you heard one, you got down in the ditch. Because if you didn't get down, and there's stories of people who didn't get down and looked up, and the shrapnel, hit them in the face or in the neck and killed them. So that's why I started this organization, but we wanted to also raise the issue politically in Washington, D.C., which we did over a long period of time. So the organization was called Sudan Relief and Rescue, and it was to take in relief to the people, but also try to rescue them through the getting the world to see this was a problem that needed to be solved. Now, the other thing that I found out, and I didn't know until I got involved, was the following. The government has taken actions that led to the revival of slavery and the slave trade. It created and armed political militias under the Popular Defense Act of 1990. It accelerated practices begun a few years earlier, arming Muslim tribesmen, the Murahalim. As Minister of Health of the NIF said, the regime has made a decision to arm the Arabs and to command them to destroy the Dinka. According to two Sudanese Muslim scholars, these actions transformed traditional tribal conflicts and allowed the Muslim tribes to take Dinka slaves on a grand scale. As a result, quote, slavery in its classical and known sense reemerged in Sudan. United Nations Special Rapporteur Gaspar Biro noted that years of inaction on the part of the government, after it was fully informed of the facts surrounding the practice of slavery, demonstrated the government's approval and support of the practice. We went in and we met with former slaves. Now, by former slaves, what I mean are those who were taken but escaped. So I would just think for a second, however your life is, you don't go to bed at night thinking that there might be raiders that come into where you live that kill all the men and take the women and children. And the women are gang raped, were kept in corrals like cattle to break their will. The children had their Achilles tendons slit so they could, because they had them herding cattle, so little 5-year-olds, that age. So we interviewed the people, we documented it. Our film, we made a film. It's at the Holocaust Museum in D.C., the Museum of Intolerance in Los Angeles. And maybe we set up a small school. The government bombed the school, killed 8 children and 1 teacher. That got it in the New York Times because we forced the New York Times to pay attention to it. I have, as John said, I'm going to talk about my experience in Sudan for the rest of the time here, also at the seminar and maybe at the summer school. I do want to tell you though, and I know there's bad things that have happened in the world and you may have had to endure some, but you know, when I was there with these people on Christmas Day, and you had the bishop I was in came in, because he was on a wanted list. He would have been shot down without trial. I mean, I would have been too, but and so he celebrates Mass, and there's hundreds of people, but we're under this gigantic baobab tree where you can get hundreds of people under it. And they sent these bombers to bomb us because they knew we'd be gathered together on Christmas. And the film shows, you know, we were running and everybody was afraid, but because we'd been under the trees, they didn't see us. So that was the reality of what people had to deal with in Sudan, and why I got involved in it was to stop the slavery, to stop the genocide, to stop the religious persecution. Now, what lessons, though, could we draw from this? I think there are 2 that are important. One is that Sudan and much of the world in different times and places is a war of visions. There are conflicting visions of the future. What's a good future? In Sudan, the National Islamic Front had an image, a future vision of everybody had the same kind of extreme radical view of Islam that it held. And it was willing to, you know, kill the Bija tribesmen or, in fact, the Nubian people themselves who had become Muslims, but they didn't conform. But it particularly wanted to wipe out Christianity. So they wanted to impose Islamization, Arabization. But the other vision was what was in the Nuba Mountains, and where I was privileged to be. The Nuba Mountains was this one of the oldest tribes in Africa, the Nuba people. There have been films made about them. They're famous for their wrestling. That's the traditional kind of entertainment they have. And I was there on Easter one time, And after Easter, we had a big wrestling thing, you know, kind of matches where different people were wrestling to see who was going to be the great wrestler. And we heard this noise off in the distance, and it was a kind of a singing, chanting kind of sound, and we weren't sure, and then everybody got excited. It was the Sufi Muslims were coming to celebrate Easter with the Christians as a kind of solidarity with them. I was there when the National Islamic Front bombed the mosque. There was a mosque, just one kind of small mosque in the Nuba Mountains. The Christians helped rebuild that mosque. The Nuba were separated or divided into three groups, about 1/3 Muslims, 1/3 Christians, and 1/3 animists. 1/3 animists. But they all were together. You know, solidarity is a Catholic term in particular, but they had solidarity with one another in community. And that vision is one of tolerance, but identity. I mean, the Sufi Muslims were Sufis, and the Christians were Christians. There was no confusion, but they weren't going to impose themselves on anybody else. And the last lesson, I'll close with this, and I'll introduce you actually later in a subsequent talk to this lady. Her name's Saint Josephine Bakhita, who was once a slave and was canonized by John Paul II in the year 2000. And I was in Rome in that crowd with the Sudanese for that canonization. And she is a great inspiration to the people of the Christian people of Africa. But my last lesson, though the second lesson I would draw, is that it's true what Tertullian said all those years ago, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, because by the time by the mid-2000s, the Christian proportion of the southern population, which had been, I said, about 20%, was over 50%. It was massive growth. Why? Because the only people who helped them were my organization and another one called Samaritan's Purse. We were the only ones that would go into some of these areas. So, you know, also from a Christian perspective, we say sometimes that what the world means for evil, God means for good, or God can bring good out of evil. So the lesson for Sudan, I think, is the vision of the Nuba Mountains is the one we should fight for. Thank you.